Jack Tracy, one of the early jazz reviewers for the University of Minnesota Daily, later editor of Downbeat magazine and producer for Mercury, put Buddy Rich and Max Roach into the studios. You're listening to them in a duel to the end called Figure Eights, and you'll hear it all in complete performance following some conversation and dialogue with Brian Grivna, who is an artist of the woodwinds and a former member of the Buddy Rich Band. Good morning, Brian. How are you this morning?
All right, just fine. How about you, Leigh?
Well, hanging in there with these memorials to Duke Ellington, Maxine Sullivan, and Buddy Rich, and it makes me feel a little sad that we're losing these giants. I know that in your tour of duty for about 3 years with Buddy Rich, you got to know him and observe him as a human being. What makes an individual like Buddy Rich really survive and continually hit at such a high level?
Boy, I can only assume that there was nothing else he could do. I don't think he could help doing what he did. That was what he knew and what he always wanted to do, and he just was born to do it, I guess. I can only conclude that there wasn't much else that he would have wanted to do, and he always did say that he hoped that he would die with his boots on, quite literally, and I guess he came pretty close at that.
Well, as you toured with that band, I'm sure you observed many scenes and incidents. Buddy was a kind of volatile figure, and you certainly had... did you get along with him well?
Yes. The thing that was always tough about Buddy is that I think most people who saw him from the outside would think of him as the persona that he projected on a TV show like the Carson Show, for example, which he always looked forward to that greatly, and we always were aware when he was going to be on the Carson Show. He'd been scheduled on the show because he was always really excited to get a chance to do that. It was a big thing for him. And, of course, he had that classic, nasty guy, smart aleck guy kind of image, but that really was a very real part of his personality. The tough part of being a member of the band was that you were never sure precisely when he was going to turn that part of himself on, because he also had a very gentle side and could be an intriguing person to talk to, but could occasionally suddenly adopt the smart aleck kind of hard-nosed leader persona, and I think he seemed particularly apt to go into that with members of the band. In the first place, I think he sensed and felt a traditional desire to keep a certain distance between himself and his employees, and it was said by many of the older members of the band that he emulated Tommy Dorsey in that regard, and felt that was the way to keep things going. And I have a feeling he was probably right for the sort of performance and the sort of playing that he wanted the band to do, which was a very intense, high-energy, excitement kind of playing. It really wasn't the kind of thing where you could afford to be too palsy and, hey, how are you, baby, kind of with the guys, and yet at times he would, I think, exude an almost lonely quality and a sort of vulnerability, and you would sense, and quite rightly, that at those times he really wanted to talk, and often then you'd learn some very interesting things, because of course he had played with everybody and done just about everything imaginable in jazz, and so when you played in front of Buddy, I mean, you were aware that here was a guy who'd played with Lester Young and Bird, and you weren't going to do anything that was terribly new to him, This was the master. But at the same time, while he would have these vulnerable and more voluble moments that were friendlier,
have you any memories of those moments when you and Buddy had conversations?
Yes, I remember on his birthday, it must have been around he was in his 50s, I can't remember just how old it was, and we were all aware that it was his birthday, and there was sort of a surprise party that someone had planned for him. And we were in Houston, and I went up to rooftop, what was supposed to be the pool, but the pool was empty, and there was no one there except Buddy, all alone with his battery-powered TV, looking sort of forlorn and very much alone. And as we sat and talked, he was much more than usual, I think, interested in me and in what I did, which wasn't something that he often would get into. And he was openly questioning of me. Well, yeah, what do you do at home? And how did you, I'd been on the band for a year, but, we didn't have that much occasion to really talk socially. And he was much more expansive than usual. It was very different.
You had mentioned earlier in one of our conversations that you had an anecdote that really was a kind of vivid memory.
I think it does. If there's any one thing I could say, and perhaps one would be enough, that would somehow capsulize this strange, almost schizophrenic character of Buddy. I'll tell the incident, but first let me say that a good example of something a little less silly than this is that he could not stand, and with good reason, as a leader and as a person, people who didn't have their personal habits under control. And we had many talented people on the band, a couple of whom had an alcohol problem, and one of whom who would periodically get himself into a terrible situation and simply not be able to play, and Buddy would almost invariably fire him that night and then rehire him the next day. And I remember him looking at me and saying, "Why do I do this for this guy? What's the matter with me?" And it's because that was the very human part of him, which sometimes it seemed he was striving to hide. But and in fact, later this same individual, Buddy, contributed substantially to seeing that he was sent to a very expensive detox center and straightened out. So that's the human and the good side that I remember. But just to show you how strangely vulnerable and hard he could be almost all at once, one night in Boston, he fired the entire band.
What was the reason for that?
Well, the band did sound a little bit sloppy. It didn't seem to me, I didn't feel like, it was any real big deal, but he just wasn't getting what he wanted out of the band, and he called a big meeting, and he not only verbally fired us, but he had the manager give us, each of us, little written slips of notice, 2 weeks' notice. And of course, this is, pretty serious, because it was a rule of the road that when the leader fired you, he paid your transportation home. If you quit or gave your 2 weeks' notice, you paid transportation, so he was going to pay transportation for 15 guys. And after that night, then we all had our 2 weeks, and he called a meeting the next night. And he said, after silence had come in the room, he said, "Well, I suppose you all know I've been seeing a shrink." Well, none of us knew that he had been seeing a shrink, and it was in itself just sort of strange that he would admit it to us. And he said, "Well, the guy told me that if something was really bothering me, I should get rid of it. So I fired your guys." And so at this point, it's very hard. Of course, everybody in the room is trying very hard to keep a straight face, And he said, "Well, I talked to him today, and he told me I made the wrong decision. And, what can you say?" And so he rehired the band. But, just for this very businesslike, could be so businesslike and hard man to admit to all these guys the basis for his decision. It was a stunning example of how his mind worked. He was just very unpredictable and very childlike in a strange way. He could be as bellicose as a child and also as sort of vulnerable. It was amazing.
Brian, your insights are really priceless, and perhaps you ought to write a book on the band business. For your own part and your role in the 3 years working with Buddy Rich, how would you assess it in 1,000 words or less?
Well, I mentioned when we spoke last week, and I do think it's really important to say, always wanted to say to Buddy. I guess I did say to him. I saw him after I'd been off the band for a couple of years, and he was extremely warm. Geez, how are you? It's so great to see you. What's happening? He kind of met my son, who was just a little baby at the time, and went gaga over him. He was just a prince. And what I remember the most is, and what I feel the most sad about, is that he created and maintained a venue for young players like myself. I got to play under older, experienced players. Jimmy Mosier and Joe Romano were my two lead alto players who played that I played under before I played the lead chair. And boy, it was a blessing I got to play under them, because I had a lot more under my belt that I could use by the time I got to play, both as a soloist, hearing these guys as soloists every night right next to them, and hearing them shape a section and style a piece. You know, it was invaluable. It was the kind of learning tool that Woody's band represented, and now apparently also fading. And so for that alone, my experience was unforgettable, and it was really a treasure. It has meant everything to me musically, and as far as the playing of big band music and jazz in general, it's been a very significant factor in my personal development. So I just have to be deeply grateful to the man for providing that opportunity.
Brian Grivna, who had the alto chair, lead alto chair in the Buddy Rich Band. And what were those years again?
Oh, it's a long time ago. 71 through 73.
Well, that certainly is a part of the life learning college in the jazz world, isn't it?
Yeah, that was the only way to learn that stuff, and it was a privilege.
It's a privilege for us to sit in with you, and vice versa, for you to give us this long look into life on the road with Buddy Rich.
Well, thanks, Leigh.
Thank you, Brian Grivna. Good night and good morning.
All right.